Okay, everybody, welcome. My name is Laura Davis, and I am an attorney at Beresford Booth here in lovely Edmonds, Washington. And we're going to go ahead and get started on our webinar this afternoon, which is called Working During the Pandemic, Can Employers Mandate COVID-19 Vaccines? So before we get started, let me just introduce myself. My name is Laura Davis. As I mentioned, I'm an attorney here. My practice area focuses on litigation and employment law. So that's who I am. And we'll get started. The presentation today is being recorded and will be available online. And also shouldn't take more than about 20 minutes or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started here. So a couple of housekeeping items before we move forward. So this is just intended to provide general information. Don't interpret this as legal advice. If you have a particular situation in your workplace, please reach out to legal counsel, such as the attorneys at Beresford Booth. We do have attorneys here who may be able to help you. And also, if you do ask questions throughout the webinar, please be mindful of, trying to phrase them as general questions instead of specific questions. Again, if you have specific questions, please seek legal advice for those. So the focus of today's webinar is going to be from the employer perspective. So there will be things addressed in here, which we'll get to in the next slide about where we're going and what we'll be talking about, but just know that this will be the focus will be on employers and employer policy. Throughout the webinar, you should be able to ask questions via the chat box. So I will try to get to those if I can, if we have time, but please feel free to ask questions on there if you have any as we're going through, and I will do my best to answer. Okay, all right. So we're going to start out here with a roadmap of where we're going today. So we're going to be talking about vaccines, and this is very relevant, especially in today's atmosphere right now. We're hearing a lot about COVID-19. We're hearing a lot about the new Delta variant, and if vaccines are on the forefront of the discussion about this. So how does this relate to your workplace, and your employees? Well, those are great questions. We're going to be discussing that this afternoon. So here are some key takeaways that we hope to address today. So mandatory vaccines in the workplace, key considerations and logistical concerns, and what a mandatory vaccine policy would look like. Okay. So let's start out with knowing where we are at here. So vaccines are considered generally safe and effective, and side effects tend to resolve within a couple of days. We've heard this information from our State Department of Health as well as the CDC. Want to just start out with some general vaccine facts and statistics, right? To just lay the groundwork of where we're at right now. As of August 10th, I just checked the statistics this morning. Over 70% of Washingtonians are vaccinated, which is great. The vaccine can reduce the risk of hospitalization or death from COVID-19. And so those are important thoughts to keep in mind, that many of the hospitalizations or deaths right now, the majority of them are among those who are unvaccinated at this point. And so those are important key things to keep in the back of our mind as we move forward. So let's just dive in now and talk a little bit about mandatory vaccines specific to employers and the workplace. So, why are we talking about this right now? So, the last year and a half has been a challenge for employers and employees alike, and many employees and employers have gone to a virtual workplace and have had to change the way that business is done in many respects. And so, so a lot of employers see vaccines as a hope for returning to the workplace for many employees. And there have been a lot of questions since the pandemic has started, but especially since vaccines have started to roll out, about how and to what extent employers can require their employees to get vaccinated. So that's going to be the focus today. And so, why are we talking about this again? Just to circle back, it's because this is an important topic right now. Vaccines are everywhere, and there may be some considerations that employers will want to make about whether or not to have a policy in place for their employees. So, can you mandate vaccines in the workplace? Yes, generally speaking, yes. The EEOC has come out, as have state authorities, and generally said yes, employers can require employees to get vaccinated in the workplace, and they can implement mandatory vaccine policies. So there has been some litigation over this issue, especially since vaccines have begun to roll out. The recent litigation on this issue has generally involved employees suing employers who have implemented mandatory vaccine policies, arguing that because the vaccines are still under emergency use authorization, that they should not be required to take them as a condition of, or required to receive a vaccine as a condition of employment. So in many ways, literally and figuratively, the jury is still out on some of those cases. But what we have seen so far is that courts have been pretty reluctant to give weight to those arguments, and have so far sided with the employers with respect to mandatory vaccine policies, and have said generally yes, even though this is under emergency use authorization, employers can mandate these vaccines as a condition of employment. So, stay tuned as to what developments will come about as a result of that any litigation that's pending and litigation in the future. But generally speaking, right now, the trend that we've seen is that courts are tending to side with the employer when it comes to mandatory vaccine policies. So the caveat, and of course, during this presentation, one other disclaimer to make is that certainly, every employer is different, every workplace is different. And so because we're just providing a very, very broad overview, there may be laws that do apply in your workplace or do not apply in your workplace. And so it's important to get those issues fleshed out. But generally speaking, accommodations are the biggest thing to consider when it comes to implementing a mandatory vaccine policy. So the two main accommodations that that are the focus is the disability accommodations and religious accommodations. And so what do we mean by this? Well, what we mean by this is if you implement a mandatory vaccine policy, you may have employees who are unable to get the vaccine because of a disability, because of a religious belief. And so with any mandatory vaccine policy that's implemented in your workplace, for employers who are subject to, especially employers who are subject to anti-discrimination laws, those employers, but really I recommend all employers implement some level of disability accommodation process in that. And so what that generally means is that you go into a stage where the employee can request an accommodation to excuse them from the policy and not get a vaccination, at which point then you would have discussion, go through the interactive process with that employee, and try to see if you can accommodate that employee. And so, what does that look like? What does an accommodation look like? Well, it could mean that the employee wears a mask in the workplace when they come into, if they need to come into the office. It could mean that, perhaps there's a work from home arrangement, or perhaps there's some other arrangements that you could work with them on to try to see, increased PPE or other issues like that. You can work with them to try to see if there's a way that you can accommodate them and not penalize, certainly not penalize them for needing an accommodation. There is this other class of employees as well who may feel unsafe getting the vaccine, or may feel that there is a safety issue with the vaccine in the workplace. Those employees who feel that way, they may be protected from retaliation. So be cognizant of that. If an employee raises a safety concern, be cognizant of the potential for retaliation if you take action against that employee. So, as you can see, these types of issues are rarely clear-cut. They are rarely the same. Every case must be looked at on a case-by-case basis. And so it's important as an employer to have some mechanism in place in your policy that would provide an avenue for an employee who wants to seek an accommodation to do so. And so when we talk about disability accommodations, certainly, there may be an opportunity to request documentation of that. The important thing to remember about religious accommodations, especially, is that the employee does not necessarily have to be part of an organized religion or a church. The definition of religion is fairly broad in the statutes, and so it's a sincerely held religious belief. And so if you have objective evidence to suggest that perhaps the employee does not have a sincerely held religious belief, then perhaps you can go from there and perhaps request additional documentation. But that would certainly be a situation that you would want to work with your HR professional or your legal counsel to flesh out and decide, because when it comes to accommodations, it's always helpful to have somebody to work through those issues with. Certainly as part of the accommodation process, sometimes there are accommodations that create what we call an undue hardship. And basically what that means is that as the employer, it would create a hardship on your business to provide accommodations for an employee. And the standard is slightly different between disability accommodations and religious accommodations. Disability accommodations, it's generally a significant cost or significant hardship. With religious accommodations, an undue hardship could be found if it's more than just what we consider a de minimis or a minimal cost. So those are some things to keep in mind. Obviously, again, this is very big picture, and so specific situations, certainly please feel free to work through those with your legal counsel or HR folks. But those are the general considerations that you're going to want to think through with any sort of mandatory vaccine policy in the accommodation that may arise among specific employees. So moving on now to, what kind of proof of vaccination is appropriate. So generally speaking, this could be a copy of the vaccine card. You also can ask employees to self-certify that they have been vaccinated. And, you can certainly kind of distribute a general form or, something of that sort. But many employers will want to probably see the vaccination card, the proof that the vaccination was administered, generally through that CDC card that's given when you get your vaccination. And, and by the way, take a step back on this, what does it mean to be vaccinated? So being vaccinated is 2 weeks past the second dose for either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, or 2 weeks following the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So when we think about vaccination status and what it means to be fully vaccinated, what we want to really focus on is sort of the public health information that is available through the CDC and through our state Department of Health and other, and those authorities to tell us what it means to be fully vaccinated. And then from there, we can use that as the foundation for the mandatory vaccine policy if you choose to implement one in your workplace. So, so the type of proof that's appropriate, a lot of employers will generally want to see the vaccine card or have employees self-certify that they are fully vaccinated. If you do request that information, which as part of a mandatory vaccine policy, you should, if you do request that, you will want to keep that documentation in a separate file from the employee's personnel file. So you don't want to include that as part of the general personnel file where you may have employment applications or performance records or those types of things. You'll want to keep any vaccine, my recommendation is to keep vaccine-related materials in a completely separate file from that, because that could be construed as confidential medical information, and so we don't want that as part of the employee's personnel record. Paying employees for the time spent to get the vaccine. So there has been virtually no guidance on this, but many employers are cognizant of wage and hour disputes when it comes to employees, and so there may be it may be advisable for you as the employer to pay people, to get the vaccine or, have them get the vaccine on company time. That's certainly an option that may help mitigate some risk of wage and hour claims, especially if you are requiring vaccines as a condition of employment. That wouldn't necessarily, paying people for the time to get the vaccine wouldn't necessarily apply if you had a voluntary vaccine policy. But if you are requiring it as a condition of employment, there is at least some argument to be made that, that should be on company time perhaps, or employees should be paid for that time. And so there's not very clear guidance on that yet, but certainly certainly that is one thing that you can do to help mitigate wage and hour concerns there. And, even if you have a mandatory vaccine policy in the workplace, it's important to note that you should continue to adhere to federal, state, and local guidance when it comes to COVID-19. And that may mean mask mandates. That could mean, certainly social distancing and those kinds of things. So to the extent that the federal government, state government, or local government requires those things, continue to adhere to that. And, if employees still prefer to wear a mask and socially distance in the workplace, certainly you should respect that, whether they're vaccinated or not. And, there are also some implications where, perhaps there's guidance that, that you don't have to wear a mask in the workplace. So if you are fully vaccinated. And so, and that has been the guidance. That could change and certainly might change in certain locales. So, so just be cognizant of those requirements on the government level. And if employees feel more comfortable social distancing or wearing masks, then regardless of whether they are vaccinated or not, consistent with the policy, they should still, be permitted to do so. So considerations and logistics. The biggest thing to think about with any mandatory vaccine policy is to plan ahead. So, you're going to want to think through several things before you actually implement your policy. You're going to want to think through how you're going to manage the verification and the proof element, what you're going to ask employees to provide as evidence that they got the vaccine, and confidentiality of those records, as we briefly discussed. You should also have a point of contact for questions and concerns. Usually that will be whoever is operating in your HR capacity, but it could be, a manager or supervisor. But I recommend having somebody as a point of contact who you can turn to, your employees can turn to if they have further questions on how the policy is to be implemented and what is expected of them. And, have a plan in place for those who do not want to get the vaccine for personal reasons. And we're not talking about an accommodation, we're not talking about a safety issue. We're talking about those individuals who, for personal reasons, do not want to get the vaccine. And it could be that the answer to that is, you provide education. You'll have to think through sort of what your consequences will be. And that's a couple of bullet points down, but you'll want to think about, okay, what are we going to do in the event that somebody is just resisting this policy? I also recommend having educational materials at hand. If you have somebody who does have questions about the vaccine, there are materials online through the Department of Health and the CDC that can be very helpful and are geared towards employers. And, certainly having those on hand that you can provide to employees could help alleviate some of those concerns. And, importantly, a lot of employees might be concerned about what their leave options are if they, come down with adverse side effects. So, that's going to be something that you're going to want to think through ahead of time as far as scheduling and, accommodating those employees who may have to be out sick because of an adverse reaction. Adverse reactions are temporary from the information that we have, but, they do occur, and generally they don't last more than a couple of days. But, certainly it's possible for an employee to have a more serious adverse reaction. It's rare, but, that would be something that they would consult with their doctor on and all of that. But, you might want to think through those leave issues. And so thinking ahead as far as workplace planning. And, lastly, there are, what if you say this is a really cumbersome approach and I don't know if I want to do this in my workplace? Well, certainly you can consider a voluntary approach or even perhaps a vaccine incentive. And a voluntary approach would be essentially saying we encourage you to get the vaccine, or not say anything at all, but generally encourage employees to get the vaccine but not require it. And so those are some thoughts, just to kind of get you started. Certainly with vaccine incentives, that's another possible option, and there are accommodations that might need to be considered as part of that, somewhat outside the scope of this presentation, but certainly there are things to consider with an incentive program as well, although that, incentive program may provide a little bit, you may have a better turnout than just having a voluntary approach and, encouraging employees to get vaccinated. So certainly there's no requirement to have a mandatory vaccine policy. It's really up to you as an employer whether you want one or not. But, you certainly can have one. And having said that, there are additional considerations we've discussed whenever you decide to implement that. So lastly, we're going to talk about what a mandatory vaccine policy should look like. And you're at the point where you are ready to start implementing this policy. You should have the policy written down and distributed to employees. And so here are some best practices for what this policy should say. You should consider the scope and purpose of the policy, who it applies to, and why you are putting this in effect. You certainly aren't required to put that in the policy, but it is helpful for employees to understand certainly who is affected by this and why you as the employer are asking them to get vaccinated. identify your timeline for compliance and what the employee would need to submit to prove their vaccination status. We've talked about that before. Discuss leave and paid time considerations. As we briefly discussed, you'll want to be thinking through that in your leave policies. And discussing the consequences of not receiving the vaccine. This is probably one of the harder parts of framing your policy, and certainly one in which, might feel the most risky, because you'll have to think through, what would we do? Would we require, heightened PPE? Would we do warnings? Would we terminate this employee? What would we actually do? And so that's a huge consideration. And so I would encourage you to really spend some time thinking through that. Whatever you decide to do as a consequence, that consequence should be applied even-handedly among all of your employees. So, you should not be applying one consequence to one employee and not doing that for another if they're substantially similar situations. So whatever you do it consistently. And provide information on how employees can request an accommodation, either a disability accommodation or religious accommodation. And, the point of contact, again, as we've discussed, is important if the employee has questions or would like educational materials. So, certainly that is going to be important as well, just to have somebody who can focus the questions and streamline those questions and have a consistent message to employees. So with that is we've reached the end of our presentation, and certainly my information is on the screen. If you have any follow-up questions, you can reach me at laura.d@beresfordlaw.com or 425-776-4100. So if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up. And it was a pleasure to do this webinar for you today, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.